Photographic Composition, Lecture 10, Architecture in the Urban Landscape, Part 1. Robert Frank wasn't particularly interested in the formal documentation of architecture when he took this image while on one of the two cross-country trips he took in the mid-1950s supported by Guggenheim grants. His objective in taking the photographs that would become the seminal book The Americans was to photograph whatever moved him in personal ways as he traveled from state to state. He may not have intended to make a grand statement about the condition of the country's collective psyche, or even his own, but once the work was finally published in France in 1959, it was seen as an indictment of American society and roundly condemned for it. The photographs in The Americans were also seen by most critics and other photographers at the time as crude, inept, ugly, and unprofessional. There is an unadorned directness in Frank's images that gives them the appearance of being true. And although some of the individual pictures of the Americans hold up well on their own, it's as an ensemble that they are their most powerful. This is a deceptively simple image. A covered car sits in front of an apartment building under a pair of large palm trees in the late afternoon sun. All signifiers that might identify this particular place appear to have been stripped of their specificity, to the point that if we weren't told by the caption that this was Long Beach, we'd just as easily believe it was Tunis or Buenos Aires. Approximately 100 years before Frank made the previous image, photographers such as Francis Frith were documenting the great wonders of the ancient world as trophies to bring back to Europe as evidence of their existence. As such, Frith gives us a number of cultural and spatial clues as to the location and size of these ancient ruins at Luxor, somewhat confused by the tower of a mosque built much later in the background. As we've seen over and over again in images like this, two men have been included for a sense of scale, as well as evidence of the style of dress of the locals. The conventions of early exotic travel photography are also visible in this image of the Khas Mahal, or Red Fort, which served as the Mughal emperor's residence next to the Taj Mahal. Of compositional note are the Taj Mahal, visible through one of the foreground building's arches, and a guard, similarly framed one archway to the right. Another photographer intent on capturing the architecture of exotic lands was the Italian Felice Beato, who worked primarily in Asia. This image of China's imperial palace is about as straightforward as a picture can get, the photographer having placed the structure dead center in the frame. Only the asymmetry of the trees surrounding it saves the picture from becoming static. The nearby pagoda, however, was treated quite differently. By placing the structure to the side, it upsets the picture's equilibrium and gives more importance to the landscape in what might otherwise have been seen as background. As some photographers went further and further afield in search of the exotic, others concentrated on locations much closer to home. The best known in Europe of these was Edward Baldus, a Prussian who moved to Paris and began photographing the public architecture of France's cities in the 1850s. He was hired by the railroad to document the stations and other structures related to trains, of which the station at Toulon was typical. Although a straight-on elevation, the image works primarily due to the building's asymmetrical design and the convergence of the tracks leading the eye into the station and beyond, into the landscape. Baldus was also commissioned by the French government to document the great buildings of France, to be assembled in a commemorative portfolio that would later be presented to Queen Victoria. This view of Notre Dame lacks the complexity that Aceh would bring to the subject over 60 years later, but it does reveal the cathedral's elements faithfully. The bridge in the foreground and the buildings to the left and right give the building a sense of its context. Also among Baldus's subjects was the vastness of the Louvre. Again, faithful documentation was his guiding principle, shooting its various pavilions straight on, maintaining correct perspective by exploiting the rising front on his view camera, without the necessity of having to do it in Photoshop later on. Interrupting the monotony of featuring such similar facades is the row of trees screening this particular pavilion. Rather than compromising the view of the building, though, the trees add to our understanding of it as an object, having a certain mass and space in relation to other objects. This view of a viaduct is typical of Baldus's direct, uncluttered approach. There's little question what the subject of this image is, shown here with plenty of context. As we have seen in other examples of Frederick Evans, he was 1. Adept at finding revealing points of view in large interior spaces, and 2. Keenly aware of the effect of light in those spaces. Here we're made very much aware of the depth of this room through the receding columns, a condition accentuated by how the light reflected off the floor falls off as it radiates away from its source. Eugene Aché has had enormous impact on photography in general, and on the photography of architecture even more so. His persistent clarity of vision and interest in the relationships of buildings to their surroundings has changed the way photographers represent architecture, whether they're aware of it or not. Here we see Paris's Pantheon looming beyond other buildings, yet commanding our attention despite seeing it through considerable haze. Although Aché was particularly interested in recording the old and even ancient places of Paris, he was also aware of the newer aspects of the city. Photographing the city from around 1890 until his death in 1927, he was witness to a place completely without the automobile to one almost completely without horse-drawn vehicles. The advance of technology had virtually no effect on Aché's process, though. His long obsolete lenses, evident from the vignetting at the upper corners of this image, will bear that out. Aché's habit was to go out into the city before sunrise, not only to take advantage of the soft, flat light, but also to avoid both vehicular traffic and pedestrians. This was a time of day when there was considerable haze visible in the air, a condition that was accentuated by his negative sensitivity to blue light. As a result, some of the scenes he recorded seemed to dissolve to white in the distance. The surrealists became interested in some of Aché's work, such as this image taken at a carnival, for they saw it as the absurdity of its content. Man Ray was particularly taken with Aché's photographs and purchased a number of prints from the older photographer before he died. Where Aché had devoted himself to great clarity in his photography, a number of American photographers at the time were experimenting with a more impressionistic soft focus and diffusion in their work. Alvin Langdon Coburn, a member of Alfred Stieglitz's photo-secessionist movement, was a devoted practitioner of this style, which lasted from the late 19th century and persisted into the 1920s. The idea was to reduce all subject matter to pure form, to give an impression of things rather than raw, clear representations of the things themselves. The hope was that the art world would embrace photography as an art form with as much value as painting or sculpture. Even when Coburn's images were relatively sharp, they would contain softer elements, such as the shadow of the building he was in, to make this shot. Here, the footpaths through Madison Square Park in snow dominate the composition. Paul Strand was also a member of Stieglitz's inner circle, who initially produced work that fit in with that of the photo-secessionists. Some of the most enduring images of the movement and the period in general were by Strand. This image, made in 1916, of a picket fence in front of a couple of farm buildings, places his aesthetic from this period front and center. A graphically strong foreground element on a slight diagonal dominates the lower half of the frame, while the upper half contains a hard-to-read barn in front of a white house, both blurred. There's no middle ground between them. In Wall Street, made the previous year, Strand juxtaposes the ominous monolithic facade of the recently completed J.P. Morgan Company building against pedestrians on their way to work in the early morning. What makes this image so memorable is a lack of perceptible scale. Because of their deep shadows, the windows appear to be a single story, when in fact they're a very tall 2 stories, making the heavily side-lit people look tiny by comparison. Although sharply focused, the image has an abstract quality due to its high contrast. By the 1930s, Strand had moved on to making images that were often shot at the smallest aperture possible on his 8x10 camera, to ensure that there would be crisp detail in every square inch of a picture, a shift that Stieglitz had also made in his relentless quest for the modern. Walker Evans was never much interested in anything other than the most faithful documentation of what he chose to aim his camera at. Whenever possible, he used the smallest apertures to ensure clarity in all quarters of his photographs. Exposures were timed to provide detail in both shadows and highlights, a trait his photographs shared with those of Ace, whose work he greatly admired. His straightforward approach, as seen here in Armonk, New York, 1930, signaled a sea change in American photography. There is no hierarchy. The house is no more important or less important than the tree or the car or anything else within the frame. The film plane of Evans' view cameras rarely deviated from perpendicular, thus keeping verticals parallel. Particular attention should be paid to objects and other structures cut off by the frame. Evans uses this technique to imply a continuation beyond the confines of a picture's edges. Nowhere in Evans' work is the strategy of referring to what can't be seen more evident than this image made in New Orleans in 1935. That year, Evans had been hired by the Farm Security Administration's historical unit to document the country's condition during the Depression. However, he was not at all good at following directions from his superiors, and pretty much did what interested him until he was let go in 1937. To our everlasting benefit, his reluctance to follow orders allowed him to make much of the best work of his career. This image among the best of his best. While the comparison is about the while the composition is about the haphazardly painted facade of the barbershop, it's also about the balcony above and to the right, the doorway below that, with the front of the car and the curb at the edge of the street, the Bourbon drugstore on the left, and the balcony above that. Portions of all of these elements come together as if in a complicated jigsaw puzzle, describing the barbershop's milieu. And topping it off, you have this woman wearing a hat with a feather and a blouse featuring an amazing cobweb design, looking confidently back at the camera. Made in the same year in Morgantown, Pennsylvania, Evans found an opportunity to divide a working-class urban landscape into sections by emphatically placing a telephone pole in the foreground, thus giving the viewer several richly complex images within the single frame. He could have quite easily moved a few steps to the right and avoided the obstruction altogether to make what might have been a pretty good shot, but certainly not one as memorable as this. Bernice Abbott, who was responsible for saving a great deal of Ace's output, was also a fine photographer in her own right. When she returned from Paris in the late 1920s, she began applying what she had learned from Ace to her observations of the architecture of New York, ultimately amassing an impressive photographic collection of buildings that had been neglected and would soon be torn down. Even though it would stand for a couple of decades after this image was taken in 1936, there is already the appearance of a doomed place about Pennsylvania Station in this image. As much as Abbott's work contains references to Ace's, this image bears virtually no resemblance to the Parisian's photography, except for a steadfast reliance on faithfully documenting what she found in front of her, in this case from the top of the Empire State Building. By now it's a familiar view, but at the time it was made, surprising for its stark black and white tonality and its lack of a horizon. Werner Manz had begun his photographic career as a portraitist in Cologne, Germany, in the 1920s, but his unadorned approach to shooting the work of local architects is what he is best remembered for now. This humble bridge, seen in a straight elevation, provides support for animated clouds and a picture within a picture below. The offices of a newspaper, photographed in 1928, don't look much like a real building, don't look so much like a real building as a spectacular set for a film noir or fantastically detailed scale model. The repeating elements of an apartment building are precisely rendered, including the equally precise shadows cast by an unseen portion of the same building. The effect defies logic. Starting in the 1920s, no one seems to have worked harder than Alexander Rodchenko to find unimaginable viewpoints for his images. His interest was to find ways of looking at things unconstrained by preconceived notions of how they're supposed to be seen. As a result, many of his images depict landscapes without sky or others without ground.